At this point, we have the scout. Unfortunately, the scout doesn't do very much. It just shoots at us, but we can't shoot back. For that, we want to connect the scout to the laser and to the grenades. Unfortunately, at the moment, the grenades don't work. So let's work on that. At the moment, the grenades only explode, which is basically an animation, meaning they don't damage anything. Or more specifically, they do not call the hit function. And what is really important for this one is that as long as the grenade is exploding, it should trigger the hit function. The laser is only calling the hit function once, and that's perfectly fine. But for the explosion, I want there to be some damage as long as any kind of entity is standing inside of the blast radius. And for this part, there is pretty much nothing new. As a consequence, all of this can be an exercise right away. I want you guys to implement the grenade mechanic. For that, number one, I want you guys to place the enemies and the player inside of another group called entity. Any node can be in multiple groups. So the scout, for example, could be in a scout group and in an entity group. Besides that, if the grenade is exploding, check the entity and the container nodes. After that, if they are close, trigger the hit function. And make sure that you're continuously triggering it as long as the explosion is playing. For this exercise, I want to give you two tips. Number one is you can combine two arrays with a plus. So if you add one array to another array, you are getting a third array with all of the elements. Besides that, there's a distance to method in every single vector. With all of that, you should be able to implement all of this yourself. So pause the video and try to work it out. First of all, I want to open the grenade scene. At the moment, there isn't very much. We have a collision shape, we have the sprite 2D of the grenade, then we have an explosion, and the explosion is controlled by an animation player. Besides that, we have a point light, and this one is a blinking to show us that the grenade is working. If we are opening the code, you can see there really isn't very much in there. I guess I should mention that we have autoplay blinking, and this one changes the energy of the light. And if the 2 seconds of the animation duration are up, we are calling the explode function, this explode function, which is playing the explosion animation. And that one is going through all of the frames of the animated sprite. To update all of that, first of all, I want to create another variable. Let's call it explosion active. This has to be a boolean, which by default is going to be false. And as soon as we're calling the explode function, we want to set explosion active to true. What that allows us to do is to use the process function and then check if explosion is active. If that is the case, for now, I want to print explosion. And with that, let me return to the blinking animation. And now if I run the game, I can shoot a grenade. And after 2 seconds, we get explosion. And we're getting this. Okay, I should do this again and fix my typo. Explosion. If I now run all of this again and not go into the inside level and shoot a grenade, after 2 seconds, we're getting explosion multiple times. Although at some point it stops, because after the play animation has finished, so in the animation player, we can look at the explosion animation. Once this animation is done, we are destroying the entirety of the scene with Q3. Because of that, the process function will not be called anymore. Also, we're not going to use delta inside of this function, so let's add an underscore. Next up, if that is the case, so we do have an animation, I want to check for target in, let's call it actually targets, just to keep it all a bit more readable. If that is the case, I want to get something like target.hit. Although we want to add one more thing, and that is if hit in target, and only if that is the case, we want to call the hit method. The issue we have right now is that there are no targets. For that, I want to create another variable. This variable is going to be called targets, and we get that with get 3, and then get nodes in group. For now, I am only going to use the containers. But later on, we are going to add a bit more in there. But for now, we have all of the containers. We're going through all of them. And if there's a hit function in them, we're going to call the hit function or method. Although I believe this should only be called container, not containers. But let's try this now. If I go to the inside level and down there, we have a crate. If I shoot a grenade at it and wait for 2 seconds, there we go. We now have the items. But there's a bit of a problem. And that is if I go to the other crates, we can see they all have been triggered. So this toilet was triggered, and then we had a few more crates up here. They have all been opened. That is because as soon as we have explosion active, we are running the hit method on every single target. But this obviously isn't what we want to do. We only want to call the hit method if a target is within a certain range of the explosion. For that, I want to create another variable. Let's call this one explosion radius. This one has to be an integer, which I want to set to 400. And then inside of the if statement, if the explosion is active, I want to get another variable. Let's call it in range. This we are getting via the target, and on there I want to get the global position. This would be a vector 2, and this is what I mentioned earlier. Every vector 2 has a distance to method. And I just realized this doesn't work because we don't have the target. I can fix that by moving this inside of the for loop. Now we have access to the target, which is important because this gives us the position of the crate or the toilet. So I'm checking the target global position, and I want to get the distance to the position of the grenade, which we are getting with the global position of this one. This is telling us now the distance between these two vectors. If that number is smaller than the explosion radius, only then do we want to call this hit method, which means we want to check if there's the method inside of target and in range. With that, I can run the entire thing again. And now if I shoot at the crate, this should still work. That's looking good. If I, however, go to the toilet, this one should still be closed. And it is, although I can still shoot at it, and this one also works. Now, for the distance, you do have to experiment. So if I shoot a grenade, let's say here, that shouldn't trigger it, and it doesn't. If I shoot it here, still doesn't. If I shoot it here, that should trigger it. Yeah, and it does. So obviously, with the distances, you do have to experiment quite a bit. 400 might be a tiny bit large, but these numbers are entirely up to you. Anyway, though, with that, we have a process function, and this one runs the hit method on the target. For now, the targets are only the crates in the toilets, but we can update that to also incorporate the player and the scout. Let's have a look at the scout. Right now, the scout is in a single group, the scouts. But besides that, I want to have another group called entity. Entities are supposed to be the objects that can move around in the game and be damaged. I couldn't really think of a good name. You might have called it damageables, but that sounded weird. So I stuck with entity. Entities are going to be all of the enemies plus the player. Speaking of which, we have to get the player scene, and the player should also get the group entity. That is going to give us the player and the scout. With that, we can return to the grenade, and let me extend all of this, because right now we are only getting the container. But I want to get the container and the entities. For that, we can simply combine these two arrays, meaning I want to get the tree again, and on that, I want to get nodes in group, and the group I'm looking for is entity. I just realized I got a typo. Instead of get nodes in group, I got get first node in group, which is another thing you can do, but not what I want to do right now. So get nodes in group, and now Godot is happy again. This would give us the enemies, or at the very least the scout and the player, but it wouldn't do anything because the scout doesn't have a hit function. So we have process and then a couple of signals, but nothing for a hit function. That we can add right now though. Let me do it all the way at the top. I want to create another function called hit. No parameters, and for now I want to print scout was hit. Besides that, I also want to go to the player, and the player has a ton of stuff. So let me minimize everything. Actually, most of it is inside of the process function. But you can tell there's no hit function for the player, which I also want to add. So func hit, no parameters. And for this one, I want to print player was hit. And now, if I run all of this again, the player can be shot at and we get player was hit. So this one is working. The same is also going to work for the scout. So we get scout was hit. And now if I shoot the grenade, we get scout was hit multiple times. The same is going to work for the player. So if the player stands next to the explosion, we get player was hit multiple times. All of that is working just fine. So that covers another really important part. Now we have the grenades working properly, so next up we can work on the actual enemy.